I want to welcome you to this week's edition of the I Have Not Forgotten Preaching Podcast. My name is David Rollins. I'm the host this week for the episode. I want to welcome you, and by way of a quick announcement, do want to mention that starting tonight through Sunday night, we do have our revival here at Marsh Memorial Baptist Church, and also want to mention that we will be having our Higher Ground Youth Meeting at the Cleveland County Baptist Campground meeting on June 3rd and 4th. So please come and be with us for each of those if you can. Tonight I'm going to be coming to you from Mark chapter number 5. Mark chapter number 5. A lot of times as way of introduction, sometimes we come to places in our lives where we get to a feeling of desperation. When we look at this particular scripture, we're looking at I'm not going to read ahead of time, but sometimes we get to a place in our lives like these three people that I'm going to mention to you that we get to a place of desperation. And I want to look tonight of what people get desperate for, and when they get into their lives, they get to a place of just utter desperation. The first thing that I see that people get desperate for in their lives, we see this first person that's mentioned here in Mark chapter 5, is that people are desperate for peace. We see a man here in Mark chapter 5 in the first 20 verses that was desperate for peace. We see this man who was in the tombs. The Bible tells us that he was in the country of the Gadarenes, and in verse 2 he says, and when he was come out of the ship immediately, talking about Jesus, there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. So here was a man who was desperate for peace. We see this man that it says, verse 3 says, he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no man could bind him, no, not with chains, because he had been often bound with fetters and chains. That this man was just seeking some peace in his life. First of all, I see the urgency of his desperation. We see the urgency of his desperation in verse 2. Again, he says, when he was come out of the ship, talking about Jesus, says immediately there met him a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit. Now, how did this man? Why was this man so urgent to see Jesus? Well, if we look at the previous chapter, in chapter 4, we see where the Bible tells us that Jesus had been dealing with the multitudes, and then in verse 35 he tells the disciples, he says the same day when even was come, he said, let us pass over to the other side. And they sent away the multitude. They took him even as he was in the ship, and there was also with him other little ships. And Bible tells us there was a storm that came up, a storm that was so great that the disciples could not handle it. And we notice there in verse 38 it says, and Jesus was speaking of Jesus again, was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow, and they wake him, saying, Master, carest not thou that we perish? And he arose and rebuked the wind, and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said unto them, Why are you so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? And they feared exceedingly, and said one to another, What manner of man that even the wind and the sea obey him? And what we kind of understand is that we see later in these verses where this man was on a steep hill, because Jesus sent the demons into the herd of swine down a steep hill. So it's very well possible that this man was sitting there the night before, watching all of this unfold with the disciples, seeing the storm unfold and seeing the peace that arose through this man, that came as a result of Jesus. But again, we see his urgency. Notice the word, he says, immediately there met him a man out of the tombs. This man had an urgency to get to Jesus. This man had a reverence once he got to Jesus. We see his humility. He says when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshiped him. This man was desperate for something. This man was desperate to meet Jesus. This man was desperate in his time of need, that he wanted to get to Jesus any way that he could. We see, thirdly, we also see this man's torment. Notice in verse 8, Jesus said unto him, Come out of the man, thou unclean spirit. And he asked him, What is thy name? And he answered, saying, My name is Legion, for we are many. It said that it could have been up to 2,000 demons living inside of this man. So who knows what the torment that this man was going through because of all the voices that he was having to listen to all at one time. We can't imagine the torment that this man felt night and day living amongst the tombs, and every time they tried to bind him, he would just break the chains. And he would cut himself. Verse 5, he says, and always night and day he was in the mountains and in the tombs crying and cutting himself with stones. So we see the torment that this man has and why he was so desperate for peace in his life. And we also see his transformation in verse 15. We see the fact that he says, and they come to Jesus and see him that was possessed with the devil, and had the legion sitting and clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. We see this man who is desperate for the peace of God, and many times there are people in this world that are just seeking for some peace. They're seeking it in all the wrong things. They might be seeking it in drugs and alcohol. They might be seeking it in the riches of this world. But whatever it is, if they're not seeking peace in Jesus Christ, they'll never find true peace outside of Jesus Christ. This man knew that true peace was going to come through Jesus Christ. He was desperate for the peace of God in his life. How many times do we see people that just get so desperate they have no idea? Everybody is just seeking for some peace in their life. We saw his urgency, we saw his reverence, we saw his torment, we saw his transformation. But in verse 20, we also see his testimony. Notice what happened with verse 19. Verse 18, he says, When he was coming to the ship, he that had been possessed with the devil prayed him that he might be with him. This man finally found peace in his life, and he just wanted to be with Jesus. Jesus suffered him not. In verse 19, said unto him, Go home to thy friends and tell them how great things the Lord hath done for thee, and hath had compassion on thee. And he departed and began to publish it in Decapolis how great things Jesus had done for him, and all men did marvel. So we see that his testimony that he had of what Jesus did. There's no doubt in my mind that he went through that town, and as he went through that town, publishing this in Decapolis, publishing it everywhere that he went, telling people, come hear about a man that gave me peace. And people are desperate for the peace that can only be found in Jesus Christ. Secondly, we see another person here in verses 25 through 34. I'm going to skip down just a moment. I'll get back to the other verses. We see another person that was desperate for the power of Jesus. In first of all, we see this lady who saw the multitudes of people thronging Jesus. She saw the multitudes that were following Jesus. No doubt that she had heard of what Jesus had done. Maybe she even heard of what Jesus had done through this demoniac. Who knows how she heard about it? The multitudes were following Jesus. Verse 25, it says, and a certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years. So first of all, we see her suffering. For 12 years she had a problem that she dealt with. For 12 years she had no power in her body at all. And we also see her poverty, not only her suffering, but her poverty. And notice verse 26, it says, and had suffered many things of many physicians, and spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. Her poverty was the fact that no matter what she did, no matter what she tried, no matter what the physicians had done, it says she never got better, but rather got worse. She spent everything she had just seeking for some power in her body. Then we see her faith in verse 27 and 28. It says, and she heard of Jesus. When she had heard of Jesus, came in to press behind. There was a great multitude thronging Jesus, and touched his garment. For she said, notice what she said, if I may but touch his clothes, I shall be whole. She was desperate for the power that she knew that could come through Jesus Christ. And then in verses 29 and 30, we see her healing. He says, and straightway. Notice there's several words here that we keep seeing immediately. And straightway, immediately, the fountain of her blood was dried up. And she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. She could feel the power of Jesus Christ touching her body through her faith. And Jesus immediately, knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned around in the press and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And then we see her truthfulness. In verse 31 it says, and the disciples said, "Thou seest the multitude thronging," and say, "Who touched me?" And he looked round about and saw her that had done this thing. And the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him. Notice, once again, we hear the words immediately and straightway. And then it says she came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. We see her truthfulness. And he said unto her, "Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and be whole of thy plague." She was just seeking for the power that could come through the power of Jesus Christ. And then thirdly, we see a man here in verse 21. It says, when Jesus was passed over again in the ship by the other side, much people gathered unto him, and he was nigh unto the sea. And there cometh one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. We see here Jairus, who was desperate for the presence of Jesus Christ. There's so many people that get desperate in their situations. And they get desperate. They get to a place where all they want is Jesus to come into their life. First thing that we see here is his reverence in verse 22. And it says, and behold, there cometh one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and besought him greatly. We see his desire there in verse 23. And it says, and besought him greatly, saying, "My little daughter lieth at the point of death. I pray thee, come and lay hands on her, that she may be healed, and she shall live." And Jesus went with him, and much people followed him and thronged him. And then we skip down to verse 35, and it says, after he had healed this woman of this plague, we see Jairus' belief amidst unbelievers. We see his belief amidst unbelievers, and while he yet spake, as he was speaking to this woman and had healed her, and while he was yet speaking to them, it says, while he yet spake, there came from the ruler of the synagogue's house certain which said, "Thy daughter is dead. Why troublest thou the master any further?" But Jairus, being someone who he was still so desperate for the presence of Jesus, that he didn't listen to the unbelievers. He didn't listen to the naysayers. Notice what happens. Jesus said, as soon as he heard the word that was spoken, he saith unto the ruler of the synagogue, "Be not afraid, only believe." And he suffered no man to follow him, save Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And he cometh to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and seeth the tumult, and them that wept and wailed greatly. And he was come in. Again, you see all these people that didn't believe what Jesus could do. He said, "Why make ye this ado and weep? The damsel is not dead, but sleepeth." And they laughed him to scorn. And when he had put them all out, he taketh the father and the mother and the damsel and them that were with him, and entered in where the damsel was lying. And then we see his astonishment. In his desperation for presence, we see his astonishment. And Jesus took the damsel by the hand and said unto her, "Talitha cumi," which is being interpreted, "Damsel, I say unto thee, arise." And straightway, there's that word again, straightway the damsel arose and walked, for she was of the age of 12 years. And they were astonished with a great astonishment. So we see those that are desperate for the peace of God, those that are desperate for the power of God, and those that are desperate just for the presence of God. I want you to notice some things here. In their desperation, all three of them came to the feet of Jesus. And their desperation, all three of them were seeking for peace. All three of them were seeking for the power that comes from Jesus. All three of them were seeking for the presence, and they all came to the feet of Jesus. They knew where their peace was going to come from. They knew where the power was going to come from. They just wanted his presence. Something also, they came to the feet of Jesus. They had faith in Jesus. And then they saw the compassion of Jesus. Everywhere that we read, Jesus had compassion on them. I don't know what someone that's listening to this today may be going through. I don't know what kind of peace that you sought in other things. I don't know what kind of power you sought in other things, and I don't know what you're seeking for. I don't know what you may be going through. But Jesus offers true peace. Jesus offers true power if we will just seek His presence in our life. Whatever it may be that you're going through, if we would just seek for and have faith that Jesus can take care of it. All three of these people. Jesus had dealt with the multitudes before, and then He dealt with the disciples, then He dealt with these three people as individuals. Jesus cares so much about us as individuals. He's willing to have compassion on us and have compassion on our souls. Maybe there's someone that's lost that's listening to this, and you say, I've searched for things, and I've searched for peace in everything except for Jesus. If someone's lost and listening to this, you can come to Jesus. You can seek His presence, and you can know true peace through Jesus Christ. Maybe there's someone that's listening to this, and you're a Christian. You've been saved for some time. Maybe you're just down and out. Maybe you're just discouraged. Maybe you just need to get back into the Word of God and realize that Jesus is still there. Just like those disciples, Jesus was still there, and He still had compassion upon them. All we have to do is ask. All those disciples had to do is ask, and Jesus calmed the storm. All He's doing is looking for a way to show Himself to you. And I hope that this will be a help and a help and a blessing and an encouragement to someone today to know that you can have peace, you can have power, you can have the presence of Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening today.
I'm washed in the blood, His crimson